I would summon you to fulfill your oath, to paint an awesome looking update to Aragorn, Isildur's heir, to coincide with a brand new edition, to bring glory to the tabletop with his charging forward sculpt, perfectly capturing his disembarking the Corsair ships in Return of the King. Hey guys, welcome to Planet Mithril. My name is Mithril, and I've decided that with the new release of the War of the Rohirrim New Edition having now dropped, it was time to revitalise 3 epic heroes from Middle-earth in time to play with this new edition. And where better to start than the 3 sculpts you guys have been asking for a long time, the 3 Hunters plastic kits. I'll be using the Citadel Ranger paints to paint up my Aragorn, but if you have other ranges and you don't quite know how to convert, don't worry, I've got you covered. I have a comprehensive paint conversion guide over on my Planet Mithril Patreon page, as well as a load of other modelling and hobby tips and a slew of PDF guides ready for you guys over on my Planet Mithril Patreon page. I'll be working my Aragorn off the black undercoat prior to painting, which I've applied using Citadel Chaos Black Spray. Brush is ready guys, let's get painting. To begin with, I'm starting as I always do, by base coating the face and hands using Bugman's Cloak. Aragorn's hair is getting a base coat using Rhinox Hide. I'm also marking in his facial hair here, but you can do this once the face is done, if you'd rather. His jerkin and base coating with a 1-to-1 mix of Dryad Bark and Thondia Brown. Warg Flesh is now being used to base coat his Ranger jacket billowing out behind him. His boots, belts and gloves I'm base coating now with a 1-to-1 mix of Skaven Black Dinge and Abaddon Black. My slightly unorthodox mix for the Elven Cloak is a 1-to-1 mix of Abaddon Black and Zemesi Desert, giving me a really nice authentic camo-like green. The final base coat at this stage is to pick out Andoril using Lead Belcher. I'm shading Aragorn's skin using a diluted shade of Reikland Flesh Shade, making sure this runs into all the recesses of the face and between the fingers. The initial tone of his skin I'm building up using a 1-to-1 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone, leaving the shade showing in the recesses. Having marked out the beard already makes it easier for me when it comes to balancing each side of his face. I'm working up the layers now using pure Cadian Flesh Tone, further fleshing out, if you will, the structure of his face, defining the nose and contours of his expression and further defining the grip of his hands. The upper highlights are being built up with a mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh, using a small amount of Kislev Flesh initially, further defining his cheekbones and brow line in particular. trying to define further that determined, shouty look on his face as he charges into the fray. The eye recesses I'm picking out now using Abaddon Black. And finishing off with 2 dots of Pallid Witch Flesh either side. Now, I'm sure I've commented on how luscious Aragorn's mane of kingly hair is in the past, and this model is no exception, albeit slightly less wavy than his Helm's Deep counterpart we've already got on the channel. I'm starting by shading his hair and beard line using Agrax Earthshade. If you hadn't by this point, now the face is done, you can mark in his beard and moustache using Rhinox Hide. Once I've made sure my shade is thoroughly dry, I'm applying a blocking layer to the hair and beard now with a 3:1 ratio mix of Rhinox Hide and Talon Sand, keeping the addition of Talon Sand more minimal initially until I've built up some texture over the hair. With my blocking layer in place, I'm defining the texture of the hair further now by upping my layer to a 1:1 split of Rhinox Hide and Talon Sand. You can see here I'm slowly starting to build up the look of flowing hair by drawing this in thin waves following the flow of the sculpted hair and feathering this onto the jawline to give the impression of hair. With the upper highlights to the hair, I've started working in small amounts of Screaming Skull into the previous mix. This will slightly desaturate the browns and give a slightly more realistic tone to the upper levels of Aragorn's hair, as it isn't super rich and luscious in the films. Again, you can see that I'm following the flow of the sculpted hair, but keeping my application more targeted so the transition from the darker layers shows through to the upper curls and waves. With the facial hair, you can see how I'm just catching the bottom of the jawline again to give the impression of light being cast over his cheeks and chin. I'm super happy with how my hair and beard are looking, well, Aragorn's at least. I'm going to apply a glaze using more Agrax Earthshade, thinned down roughly 4:1 using Lamia Medium. Now before we start tackling Aragorn's clothes, I'd love to know what is your favourite sculpt of Aragorn that Games Workshop have done. Seeing as now we've painted a fair few on the channel, it seems I think I'd have to go with the Heroes of Helm's Deep sculpt for his charging forward on top of the Deeping Wall. That sculpt holds a lot of nostalgia for me as a young wide-eyed hobbyist in my younger years. But sound off in the comments. I'd love to know which Aragorn you think is the best sculpt. Right, now back to business. Aragorn's Jerkin, I'm giving a shade now using Nuln Oil. Nuln, and not a brown shade you ask? Yes, as I want to give some real depth and age to my leathers for this Aragorn, so the Nuln Oil works perfectly here for this. With this now thoroughly dry, I'm layering over the leathers now using pure Thondir Brown, making sure to leave the Nuln Oil showing in the recesses as best as I can, focusing primarily on defining the flow of movement, the folds below the waist, as there isn't too much of the upper chest showing given his pose. I'm going to be using Baneblade Brown as my main highlighting addition, and this is a super light, almost tan brown, so it will naturally age the leathers as I progress through the highlight stages, giving it a more sun-bleached, worn look without too much hassle or work, starting from a rough 2:1 mix of Thondir Brown and Baneblade Brown to begin with. I've been adding in more Baneblade Brown as I continue to build up the upper levels of light over the Jerkin. You can see here that with my mix now sitting at a rough 2:1 ratio in favour of Baneblade, and with careful, precise application, the leathers of that travelled, worn and almost cracked look which I was hoping for. Perfect for our wandering king to be. When I'm happy with how my leathers are looking, I'm just going to apply a glaze to the jerkin now using Seraphim Sepia, thinned down again with Lamia Medium, much like the glaze for the hair was. Aragorn's iconic Ranger coat, now I'm giving an initial shade using Croak Green. This is less vibrant and less intense than Bealtan and Athonian are, and reacts really well with the tone of the Wild Flesh base coat. As with the jerkin, I need to get the movement and flow of the material locked in nice and early for the coat to really nail that dynamic pose and look of Aragorn charging forwards. I'm using a blocking layer now with a 3:1 mix of Wild Flesh and Strachan Green, and building up the texture of the coat, leaving the shade showing in the recesses. The Strachan is very bright, so keeping additions slightly more minimal will be key to keeping a realistic tone. The upper arm folds and material around the sides is very well sculpted and detailed, compared to the slightly flatter and larger surface areas of the material hanging down by his legs. Here you will need longer, more controlled brush strokes to keep a consistent finish. Continue building up the tone of the green jacket until you reach a layer using a 1:1 mix of Wild Flesh and Strachan Green. By this point, the flow and billow of the jacket should be really taking shape and ready for some more precise upper highlights that will really make the greens pop against the rest of the model. Strachan Green is slightly too stark and vibrant to take up to a highlight stage on its own. Instead, I'll be adding in small amounts of Ushabti Bone into the overall mix, starting small at first, a rough 3:1 ratio, and building up from here. With this mix, you want to just catch the most prominent folds of material, really reinforcing the flow of movement across the jacket. You can take this highlight as light as you want by adding in more Ushabti Bone, but be careful not to overdo it and lose the realism you've built up to this point. Now what if I told you I could create the perfect green look of the Elven Cloaks without actually using any green paints? Would you call it wizardry, sorcery, dark magic? No, I call it colour theory, but my recipe here I think works super well. Have a look. Before I delve too far into that, I'm first going to apply a thorough shade to the cloak using Athonian Camo Shade, making sure I work this into all the recesses to try and avoid any build up in one area as it dries. So as much as I love the Citadel green tones, some of them can be really tricky to use as they don't always cover the best. My way to get around this for the super sleek look of the Elven Cloaks is simply not to use them. You can see the super detailed texture and flow of the cloak is already starting to show through just from my base coat and the shade. Now, as with the jacket and jerkin, I'm applying a blocking layer to further define the shape and texture of the cloak by upping the concentration of Zemesi Desert in my original base coat mix. I'm looking to go to a rough 3:1 ratio in favour of Zemesi Desert, leaving the shade showing in the recesses. To bring up the slightly pastel-y look which the Elven Cloaks have from the films, I'm going to be adding in small amounts of Screaming Skull into the previous mix and start building up the highlights. The beauty of my method of painting these cloaks is that you can make the initial tone however deep and rich as you like, depending on how much Zemesi you add for the base coat stage. Less Zemesi is a more washed out look, more Zemesi you've got a more rich vibrant green to work off. You can see how here I'm just carefully and slowly drawing my brush along the flow of the cloak, letting the sculpt guide where my brush goes. And it's as simple as continuing to add more Screaming Skull into the mix for the following extreme edge highlight stages. Again, adding as much or as little as you want, depending on how bright you want to make those upper levels. Again, just a word of caution not to overdo it and completely desaturate the tones you've been building up. See how easy that is? 3 colours, no greens, and a perfect looking Elven Cloak. Perfect for camouflaging against those eagle-eyed Easterlings. The boots, belt and gloves I'm now giving a quick targeted shade using Nuln Oil. With this dry, I'm framing the boots and gloves as well as the edge highlighting the edges of the belt using Eshin Grey. The braces over Aragorn's forearms I'm carefully picking out now using dryad bark. At this stage as well, I'm carefully picking out the ties and ropes that do up his boots and any other brown leather details I have yet to pick out. These are now being given a quick targeted shade, this time using Agrag Surfshade. It doesn't matter if you spill out too much onto the boots, as any extra muck on them just adds to his rangery travelling look. These areas are now being given extreme edge highlight using Gorthor Brown, taking particular time with the braces to pick out the intricate Gondor filigree that runs over the surface of them. The Evenstar, and of course the Ring of Barra here, can't miss that now it's actually Wargear in his profile, are now being picked out using Lead Belcher. All the silvers I'm giving a super sharp edge highlight using Ironbreaker, drawing this in long lines down the edges of Andoril to give it a real sharp, dangerous look, defining the pommel further and just creating some subtle reflection over the metallic surfaces. Aragorn's inner shirt now, the super tiny bit up by his neck beneath the jerkin, I'm just carefully picking out using Corn Red. The Elven brooch is now being painted using Warpstone Glow, the only bit of green to get anywhere near this Elven Cloak. The edges of which I'm now carefully picking out using Strachan Green. And the final detail is just to hit the end of the dagger pommel with some Retributor armour. There you have it, a stunning, updated sculpt to our lost King of Gondor, which with a few alterations to my original Fellowship recipe has been brought to life to wreak havoc against Orc kind, with his friends Legolas and Gimli at his back, and very soon joining him on the channel. For basing tips, please head over and check out my 5-minute basis playlist. I hold your oath fulfilled. Go. Roll. roll some dice. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for video notifications. And until next time, guys, take care, and as always, happy hobbying. Bye, guys. What say you?